My name is Paul Vallet. I'm an Associate Fellow with the GCSP. I've been Associate Fellow since November 2015. Prior to this, I had an academic career. I received my PhD in history from the University of Cambridge in 2006, and I've taught a variety of courses in modern history and international relations at various institutions in Europe and in North America. The peacemaking that takes place between 1918 and 1923 occurs under very specific circumstances and particular characteristics that really explain the outcome and the criticism that has been leveled on a historical point of view to this peacemaking. The first characteristic is the fact that the hostilities were halted by an armistice, which is a military convention for a standstill that preceded the peace negotiations leading to the treaty. What we know is, in fact, that there was a string of armistices in the end of 1918, in fact 4 separate ones, and the one on November 11th was the final one which halted the hostilities on the Belgian and French so-called Western Front. There is a fact that each of these armistices was requested by the Central Powers from the Allies, each acting separately, and it's really being faced with the desertion of its allies and the prospect of a revolution breaking out at home that convinced Germany to finally sign the armistice on November 11th. What then came as a nasty shock was that the fact that the German military, as well as the German society and political leadership, had not yet admitted the reality of their losing the war and of being under the threat of invasion by the Allied armies. So when the Allies then proceeded to ask for very harsh military terms and harsh peace terms in the negotiations, that came in as a very nasty surprise. The second characteristic was the fact that for the first time in diplomatic history, the main negotiators were the heads of government and heads of state of the principal Allied victors. It was a particular role that was devolved to the US President Woodrow Wilson, the British and French Prime Ministers David Lloyd George and Georges Clemenceau. And that, in fact, had an important impact on the negotiating process itself, because it added a great deal of domestic politics to the negotiation process. And that also complicated the way of finding the exact terms. The third characteristic was the fact that there was a project that was to add to the normal peacemaking process of the immediate years after the war, was the idea that you would create a new mode of diplomatic negotiation that would ensure the future and normal conduct of diplomatic and international relations. And this was, of course, the League of Nations project. This also complicated, unfortunately, the negotiating process, because such was the importance given to the realization of this ultimate project that each of the negotiating parties felt that they could leverage their support to the League of Nations in return for them to get their demands in terms of a financial or territorial reparation. And so, of course, that led to a very difficult, not entirely satisfactory negotiated treaty, which became the Treaty of Versailles in June 1919. What we were seeing was the fact that the armistice itself preceded the peace negotiations, and the armistice being a military convention to halt hostilities, that gave paradoxically the military and the military factor an added weight into the peacemaking process as well. The Allies began by asking in their armistice terms of November 1918 for a number of military guarantees that really transformed not just a situation on the front, but gave them the leading military advantage. And the fact that they were allowed to advance up to the Rhineland, the German army had to pull out from all of its occupied territories in France and Belgium, that really obviously was something that turned what was the unacknowledged defeat of the Germans in the fall of 1918 into a military defeat, and military and political defeat as a whole. The second aspect was that then the Allied military commanders were also able to stress to the civilian leaders who were conducting the peace negotiations the fact that there was a necessary emphasis to place on military guarantees to prevent the hostilities from breaking out again in the ensuing decades. And this was, of course, only natural given the enormous human and military toll of the past 4 years. But the results, obviously, were perhaps much harsher terms than what had been expected in the original by the civilian negotiating teams. And, of course, from the German point of view, that even turned the situation of being imposed peace terms even more sour. By refusing to accept this political and military defeat, the German army itself played a very crucial role in creating a latent desire for revenge and the preservation of nationalism in Germany for the years to come. What also, of course, occurred for the other countries in Central and Eastern Europe in particular, the borders that were created as a result of the peace settlements created a number of new nations, nation-states as well in Europe. That too was, of course, a factor to rather reinforce nationalism in Europe rather than abate it. And this, of course, offered a poor prospect for reconciliation in the future years. This idealism somewhat survives in the fact that it was corrected after 1945 by the putting in place of the United Nations system. That was very much aimed at taking stock of some of the mistakes that had been observed in the peacemaking of the period following the First World War and the unsuccessful experiment with the League of Nations between the two world wars. What also, of course, survives is the fact that there's an approach towards conducting diplomacy and international relations in a very novel way through multilateral forums, which in many ways, even if some of them get critiqued nowadays, they have broadened the scope in which traditional international relations are conducted. And it's really remarkable up to this day to see the range of issues that go much beyond the preservation of the peace and disarmament. They deal with economics, trade, finance, human welfare, health, the sea, agricultural production, telecommunications, and all of these issues have materialized themselves in the broadening of United Nations and international agencies. A great many of them, of course, still have their seat in Geneva. That is a very physical manifestation that we have here in Geneva of the survival of this idealism. Now, GCSP finds its place in this universe because in its own particular way it contributes to fostering a common working culture amongst the various experts who are brought to bear in operating these new types of multilateral international organizations, which is something that even some of the experts debating in 1919 had foresaw but not been able to put into practice themselves. Today, GCSP is a place of meeting, discussion, training, and reflection on a variety of these broad issues for people who are interested in the issues of conflict resolution, but also furthering and broadening the understanding of the notion of human security. So in fact, we really do have a very strong inheritance in these institutions of the people who 100 years ago wanted to end the war, to end all wars.